Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Index podcast, where we come together every couple of weeks to discuss on-chain data, chart crimes, and metrics that move the crypto industry. And today, a very special episode. We have two guests with us. But first of all, the hosts of this podcast are Denning, on-chain corgi at Flashbots, Hildobby, resident data host of Dragonfly, and me, that is Boxer. I'm the community powerhouse at Dune. And with us today, we have Mark, the optimistic chain scaler, and Alvin, the shadowy event creator. And today we are going to discuss should events be on-chain, should events be off-chain? What is the future of on-chain events? And first of all, or before we really start, we gotta get something out of the way. Nothing we say here should be relied upon as legal, financial, investment, tax, or even life advice. The views expressed in the podcast are not representative of our employees' views. With that out of the way, Mark, Alvin, so great to have you. And maybe if you could both give a 1-minute introduction to what you do and how that relates to events. And Alvin, you go first.
Cool. Yeah, excited to be here. I'm Alvin. I'm one of the co-founders and the CEO of Shadow. Shadow provides tools and infrastructure that allows anyone to log any data that they want on any smart contract at any time. So this enables like a single developer to generate event data and write data pipelines in minutes without complex like ETL pipelines or additional off-chain infrastructure.
I'm one of the co-founders of Optimism. We maintain the Optimism superchain and the OP stack. The OP stack is an SDK for building L2s and L3s like rollups and optimiums, and you can build ZK rollups with it. And the superchain is this network of blockchains that all kind of build together, and we're working on making them interoperable right now.
And what would be the standing of on-chain events or no on-chain events for you guys?
Yeah, I mean, so I think the short answer, which might not be super satisfying, is that it depends. We sort of see that ultimately it's up to smart contract developers to decide kind of based on what their anticipated needs are of whether events should be on-chain, logged on-chain, or perhaps tracked in a different way off-chain through traces, something else. Our goal at Shadow is mostly to empower developers to have more control over like what, how, and when they log contracts. And what we've kind of seen with our existing users is actually like oftentimes they're logging additional data that isn't currently logged on-chain. So kind of like despite the prevailing perception, like our goal is not to necessarily move all logs off-chain. I actually think that's kind of an uninspiring goal and kind of loses sight of the bigger picture. Instead, we're a lot more excited about a world where there's 1-2 orders of magnitude more data being generated about on-chain activity. But it's really difficult to kind of see how this would happen with the way that on-chain logs work today, which I'm sure we'll get more into later in the episode.
Yeah, totally. So blockchains are all about resources, right? Like you pay for the resources that you use, and then everybody that is running the blockchain node needs to reproduce all that work that the user is paying for. And logs are a really useful tool for showing what has happened, because at the end of the day, transactions, they're all like ones and zeros. Like you go and you look at Etherscan, it's like, how do you even know what's going on, right? So we really need to be able to display information in useful ways for users so that they can gain value from using blockchains. So when thinking about whether to use events or whether to not use events, it should really be a business-focused decision, right? Like we need to grow up and build real products that people want to use. Otherwise, this industry is not going to make it, right? So when thinking about events, we should really be thinking about, what value add are we creating for our users? And, to be able to answer that question, we first have to think about, who are our users, right? If your users are the people that are sending transactions, then maybe you want to, think about using shadow events, because then you can, lower their fees, because you can remove the need to, produce the events in the blockchain. which, like I said a minute ago, you have to pay for that, right? But if your users, if it's really important, if your growth comes from easy introspection of what's happening on chain, then, maybe you do want the logs as part of your application. So everything is trade-offs. Know your user and, create value.
All right. So two maybes, or it depends on the situation. So maybe if we take a step back first, and okay, what are events actually? So I've kind of like prepared a little blurb. It's data stored within transaction receipts, and every time somebody calls a function on chain, if that function has an event that is configured to be emitted during the execution of that function, the event will actually be emitted, and then it kind of just lives in the transaction receipt forever. So all full nodes will carry the data of that event log for all time going forward. And that, like, over time produces a significant kind of like storage load on the nodes. And there's also no real limit to like how big the log can be. So like theoretically, like as a thought experiment, you could like produce a log that like fills an entire block. Obviously nobody does that because that would be like very useless in the context of like L2s where gas gets very cheap. If people like emit bigger and bigger event logs over time, like technically like events can kind of access everything like inside of the state of the smart contract, or like everything within the execution of that specific function. So yeah, that just to set the context. To go into the details of the gas costs, like I don't think anyone will be able to follow us there. So it costs gas to emit events, not a small amount, but also not giant amounts. And yeah, why are we actually having this discussion right now? I think one is like the emergence of products like what Alvin's building with Shadow.xyz. And then there's another team called Ghostlogs, which are both kind of building infrastructure to produce a shadow or ghost fork of the local, of a EVM network. And then within that local fork, you can define additional parameters to emit more events inside of that local fork. Correct me if I'm wrong, Alvin. Like, does that match a description that you would sign?
Yeah, definitely.
All right. So then, okay, so these products exist. But why are we having this discussion? Like nobody's even talking about like, should we like remove events? Except Hayden Adams from Uniswap, who just went out on Twitter and is like, he's not aggressively kind of touting this, but he has had a Twitter poll of like, should we remove all events from Uniswap v4 to save 1% on gas? And I think the poll in the end was botted, so like the results are very inconclusive. But there was a big like industry discussion around like, should we do this? Should we not do this? And since that discussion, like it's kind of like lingering in the background of like analysts and like the data space more generally. So we thought let's just actually discuss this. And then I think like 4 weeks ago or a month ago, Vitalik has actually submitted EIP 7708, which proposes to include locks for all Ethereum transfers. So like currently for Ethereum, like any transfer of like actual Ether, you need to fish for in the traces data. There's like uncle blocks. There's like a lot of complication of like, how do we actually like know when Ether has been transferred? And like analysts on Dune and flip side on Nance have all been like, why is this so hard? Like this fucking sucks. Vitalik's proposal is very much in the wake of like, we should just make like Ethereum transfers emit a lock similar to ERC20 transfers. So yeah, with that monologue, let's go back into the discussion. But hopefully that provided useful context. So Dobby has prepared some data, and actually he hasn't prepared the data himself. Alvin has prepared some data, but Dobby and Alvin are gonna chat about the dashboard that Alvin built.
Yeah, so let me share the dashboard. I think the best way to go about this is maybe Alvin, you can walk us through the data and tell us what you want to showcase.
Yeah, definitely. So we put up this Dune dashboard just to kind of help people visualize and see what the kind of current state and like past state of what the kind of cost to the network has been with emitting events on Ethereum L1. So you can see, the event gas cost by month in terms of USD and in terms of Ether. It's relatively spiky, kind of, correlates with the price of Ether and network activity overall. And then we actually found ourselves, like oftentimes when talking to customers, they didn't really know always, like how much gas they're actually spending or their users were spending on events per different contracts. And so we had kind of found it valuable to be able to just paste in a contract address and be able to see what that looks like kind of over the last 30 days or the last year or so, or over all time even. And so there's some interesting insights you can kind of just look at and be able to kind of quantify a little bit more like what the end costs to your users are when you decide to include a particular event in your contracts. And like Mark said earlier, I think the goal of this is not let's eliminate this to zero, right? It's really about kind of what are the trade-offs that you're making, what makes sense for your product, company, business, and what you're using these events for, and and also helps you think about, if you wanted to add additional events, what that cost might look like too, right? In terms of increasing the number of events that your contracts might be emitting. I also think it would be valuable to back up for a second, kind of go back a little bit to what Boxer was talking about earlier of just what are blockchain events? Because I think it would be helpful to kind of illustrate the point of view that we have at Shadow for what events are and what they're useful for. And so we sort of see the only real sources of truth on chain are traces and state diffs, right? Everything on top of that, including event logs, including on-chain event logs, are really just kind of an interpretation or a semantic enhancement that helps you more easily understand what is happening on chain. And the way that on-chain logs work today is that they're written by the original smart contract deployer at one point in time. And once they're kind of deployed, or if you're not the deployer yourself, you don't really have control over what's being emitted, right? And oftentimes it's not until a system actually runs in the wild do you start to observe everything of what's happening, and you start to ask questions that will lead to you wanting more data. But by then it's too late to add on-chain events. And so we think that there's many different ways that interpretation and semantic enhancement kind of happen today with on-chain data, like subgraphs, like Dune spells, things like that. And so a lot of that is off-chain, and it's pretty clear that on-chain events in the way that they work today just aren't sufficient as is, right? You need to write transformations. You need to kind of manipulate that data in order to get something in a useful format that you can use. And so we sort of see off-chain events as another type of interpretation primitive that empowers people to get the exact data that they need in the exact format they want. So instead of the abstraction of a subgraph or a Dune spell, we offer a different abstraction, which is you actually just write it in Solidity or Viper directly in the smart contract themselves. And so, for example, you can instead of writing transformations with ETH calls and subgraphs, you can just write all of that logic in the smart contract itself and then emit it as an off-chain event. And the nice thing about that is you can do this at any time after the contract is deployed. There's no network cost to doing so, right? The full nodes don't need to store any of this. And anyone can do it. So it's permissionless. You don't need to be the deployer to be able to kind of add this augmentation or add this additional interpretation layer to a contract. So that's, I think, kind of a just background on kind of how we see what events are and what the limitations are today with on-chain events and how off-chain events kind of add to that.
I think a very quick clarification there. It's you said only traces and state is kind of true and what's actually happening on the blockchain. I think there's a trust assumption that if Uniswap has included those events themselves, they're actually true, because I could emit any bullshit inside of the event. But if Uniswap has deployed these contracts themselves, they have written those events, it's they don't need to be true, but I just trust the Uniswap devs the same way that I trust them to execute my trade. So yeah. I think in that sense, or is there a nuance there that I'm not quite understanding?
No, I think that's absolutely right. You are trusting, there's a trust assumption of the contract deployer, right? That the event logic that they wrote is accurate and kind of is represented accurately. And most of the time that is a safe assumption to make, right? I think the developers, generally like want to make those events as accurate as possible. But sometimes, mistakes happen. Like, there's a famous, event bug in the CryptoPunks contract. And sometimes there's the events themselves are just simply like kind of incomplete or insufficient, because not all the use cases of like what you might want data for have been predicted at the time of deployment. Like, imagine if like a Web2 company, before they ever launched their product to like a single user, they had to like predict all the different data that they might want logged, right? It's kind of a crazy proposition if you think about it that way. And then in very small percentage of cases, there's actually, there's actually like malfeasance, right? Where people try to trick people based on the logs that are generated, but that is a relatively small kind of like percentage of the logs that are out there. But there is a trust assumption. You're exactly right.
Yeah, there's there's some stuff like address poisoning that definitely use events in a way to trick users into copying the wrong address. And there's even I remember some smart contracts on some ERC20s being forked so that the sender and or recipient were actually not the real recipient or sender. And that was used as a phishing attack method in some way on Polygon. I didn't fully understand because it wasn't too deep, but like it does speak to the fact that you can tweak those events and make them show whatever you want. So there's a trust assumption in a way, I guess, that if you haven't read the Solidity code or if it's not been public, but in general, that's not really the type of smart contract that I think I'm into analyzing anyways. But I looked into your data, and I think that's really interesting. I think, first of all, props to you for having data, at least on this. I think it's we're big data nerds, so we're all for it. I was wondering, in terms of percentage of gas cost, how much do events represent for the end user? And is that a significant overhead in terms of smart contract optimization, or is it more about chain scalability and the optimization at the infra layer and being able to increase the gas limit and stuff like this? Which is it, and where do you lean here?
Yeah, so based on our analysis, events make up about 7% of total gas costs over the last month. Over the last year is about 6%, and it fluctuates between like 4 to 7%, generally speaking, month to month. Right now, a single event on Ethereum costs between 30 to 50 cents to emit. And the current run rate is about $10 million per month. So like $300,000 in gas is spent every day towards emitting events. And this scales up, of course, as the price of Ether goes up and as network activity goes up. So in March, it was like 30 million a month. And in November of 2021, like during the kind of peak of the last cycle, $71 million was spent on event gas in a single month. So it's significant, but like not like a crazy amount of the total gas spend. And so we sort of see this as like, going back to kind of what I talked about earlier, like what we would love to see and what we sort of think like should happen in like crypto data is that way more structured data should be generated about on-chain activity, especially as the types of kind of use cases kind of grow, they get more complex, and teams become more data driven with like their own kind of product development and their business decisions. We sort of see like room for that amount of kind of data to 10x to 100x. And so we're more thinking about like what that future state looks like if the event cost in terms of gas goes up by 10 or 100x, like that clearly isn't tenable, right? And so we're kind of preparing for that future, and like you were talking about, Hildabi, I think there's implications for both end users in terms of the amount of gas that they're actually paying, but then also on the infrastructure side, right? Like nodes like would not handle that increase. And so with off-chain events or shadow events, we're kind of presenting an alternative for how this can happen.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. I assumed, or I may have read incorrectly, that the percentage was lower. So that's actually higher than I thought, and maybe represents more of a bigger trouble than I thought originally. I thought I read 1% before, but maybe I read that wrong.
I mean, it very much depends on the use cases. So like in
of course. I mean,
like you,
yeah,
like if you look at some like DEX aggregation that 1inch or Matcha or CowSwap are facilitating, there's like I don't know, there's like 50 events, but then also like the total amount of gas is like more. So I think it's like very, very use case specific. And like, it would actually be interesting to break this down by sector of like how much are NFT people like spending on events versus like how much are SocialFi people spending on events and so on and so on.
Yeah. So like Seaport, last time we looked at it, it was actually closer to like 10 or 11% of total gas costs were being spent on events. The Seaport is the largest kind of gas guzzler in terms of events for a single contract.
It wasn't even good events.
OpenSea in general is the biggest protocol in terms of state size on Ethereum mainnet. I think the second one is Xen, which is more of a spammy. I don't know how to describe Xen. That doesn't matter. I think there's also something to be done about optimizing events in the first place and what is actually emitted. I find a lot of time that when I'm working on like new spells for Spellbook for like public tables on new protocol, whatever, some stuff is unnecessarily emitted and some stuff is omitted, although it really is like primary in terms of what you would be looking for. I guess a good example for something that have made it harder with the lack of events is like for NFT marketplaces, the fees in general, protocol fees, royalties are often omitted, which is easy when you have a single transaction with one trade. When you have an aggregator with 15 trades and stuff, that's like hell to track. And that makes it much harder for everyone. But I am excited actually for use case of Shadow as kind of like Spellbook alternative where you can have all these events aggregated and normalized into tables that you can pull from straight away rather than having to make your own table where you have all Uniswap trades and all other dexes or whatever. And I think that is a cool thing that we could all query and use globally.
Yeah. I think it's also what we've kind of seen is that what is necessary or critical changes, right, based on who you are and what you're trying to do. So, today with like the current status quo of on-chain events, it's really just the smart contract developers decide what is critical or necessary to them or what they might think might be critical or necessary. But everyone else kind of like downstream of that doesn't really have control over deciding that, right? Maybe you'll like hop into Discord and like ask someone to like please add this parameter to this contract, to this event or this contract. But we sort of see as very valuable for anyone to be able to kind of just write a few lines of Solidity and be able to kind of get that data themselves.
Yeah, I wish there was more communication between smart contract developers and those people who actually want to use in some way the events. Because it would be beneficial for everyone involved, I think. And also, please write your docs better in general for everyone.
So we also mentioned, like from your question, Dolby, you also, I guess, like kind of asked about from the perspective of validators. I'm curious about Mark's opinion here. Like, do you see events as the biggest bottleneck for Ethereum or any blockchain to scale? And like basically from your perspective, like what are the right way to break down what should be used for the state of a blockchain? And like I don't know if you've come across this like blog post from Paradigm a while ago from Storm, where they analyzed about like what's the breakdown of the Ethereum state that's being used, and the biggest chunk is ERC20, and like within it a large chunk of it taken by Zen, like XEN, like the whatever, I guess like shitcoin, in my opinion, like what do they even do? Like there's accounts, there's ERC 722, then there's DEX DeFi, and there's like game and bridge and stuff. I'm curious about your view, I guess also tied to like the optimism roadmap. What are the right way to distribute the state of a chain?
Totally. So when thinking about validators in particular, one really important thing is making sure that it's really easy to run the software, right? The more difficult that it is to operate a validator, the less people will be able to do it. So that creates this centralizing force, right? So one common centralizing force is the hardware requirements. So as the hardware requirements go up, which that includes, say, like the size of the database, and the size of the database goes up with more logs and more state, right? So as the size of the database goes up, it becomes more difficult for people to operate validators And then therefore it's a centralizing, force on the network. And layer 1 Ethereum has committed to, home staking. That's like one of the tenets. We'll never give up on home staking. It's like really, really important. So every single decision that we make, it needs to take into account how it will impact home stakers. So one major problem today, right, is the size of the blockchain database is constantly growing, right? In the most ideal world, right, we have a blockchain database that is constant size over time. That's like, the platonic ideal of blockchain design. With EIP 4844, the idea here is, we have like these like blob transactions, right? And it was designed following this principle because basically the blobs are pruned over time. So it will add like something like 50 gigabytes of disk space, but that disk space will never grow over time. It's a constant 50 gigabytes, and it's consistently pruned over time. So you don't need to worry about, your database growing massively, but that is not possible with state, and it's not possible with history, right? History is like the block data, and that's where the logs live. And then state, that's like the storage of smart contracts and the smart contracts themselves, right? So there's been a lot of thought that has gone into how to expire both state and history. State expiry, very complicated, creates very, difficult user experience things. Going to skip over that one for now, but there's a ton of, reading out there if you Google it. History expiry, that's a lot easier. The latest EIP that people have been talking about here is EIP 44s, right? And then the idea with 44s is that you take the old blocks and the old logs, and you no longer serve them over the P2P network. You can kind of think of it as like snapshots, where you break the blockchain up into chunks, and you basically only load a chunk into a single node. And then to like be able to read the whole chain, you kind of like compose together like multiple nodes that are responsible for a particular chunk. And when I say chunk here, I just mean like, from block 0 to like 1 million, right? And the next chunk would be like 1 million to 2 million. So this is kind of one way to try to define a max database size for a blockchain node. So once the node's database grows too large, then you kind of define a new chunk, which I believe that the core devs are calling them era files. There's like this format that any node can like import the data from, and they're trying to figure out how to distribute them. Like they might use BitTorrent. So the idea here is to try to understand like, all right, what can we assume the max size of a database is? And then we can come up with this way for sharding it between multiple nodes. And then when you want to do a query, you kind of have to string together a query from multiple nodes. And then validators would only have to run the most recent one, and they can drop the old data so they can keep their database small.
So first of all, how much would that allow us to scale more than it currently does to change to that current scenario explained?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, this is a resourcing problem. When we think about blockchains, we have to think in terms of resources. So we have like CPU, that's kind of like doing like add and subtract and multiply, right? And then we have disk, and disk that's like writing and reading from storage. And then we have, network bandwidth that's like call data or blobs now. They're all coupled together, right? And right now, the biggest bottleneck is the disk operations, right? And also hashing. Hashing is also like a big one. Like Solana skips this like hashing step where they don't like Merkleize all their state for every block. But yeah, I mean, we can definitely get more scalability, but like we need to attack the bottleneck, and the bottleneck right now is the disk IO. So to get more scalability, I think that we need to work on our database layouts, and logs do impact writes to the database and reads from the database when you're like fetching the data, right? So to some degree, logs do slow down the chain, but they're not like the worst thing ever.
Do you have a short list of the worst things ever, of like top 3 or something that you think in the short term future we want to fix first?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, so one major problem is the larger the database, the slower everything becomes, right? So that's why EIP 4.4s is really important. And we need to be careful about how often we change the gas schedule. And we also need to be careful about what we couple the gas schedule to, right? And when I say the gas schedule, what I mean by that is, the pricing of specific opcodes. So every few hard forks, we like change the cost of an opcode, and it becomes really complicated. Like, I think gas needs to be like really simplified. Like, as a smart contract developer, it's like really, really difficult to know how much gas your application is actually going to use. You kind of just like, do something and hope for the best. And then even like the testing tools aren't amazing. Foundry recently added some stuff that like makes it better, but it's still really difficult to like know exactly what's going to be happening on chain. So I think another thing that would be really helpful is basically if we just multiplied all units of gas by 10, this would be like really, really useful, right? Because we have a lot of opcodes that are priced at 1 right now. And you can't really like have like an opcode that's priced at like half of 1, right? Because it's all done in integers, it's not floats. Right. So this is like an old idea. There's like an old EIP from the TurboGeth team. They were like trying to do this back in like 2018 or something like that. It never really took off, but I think that this would be a really useful way to have more accurate pricing, right? I think when it comes to blockchains, pricing of the operations of the work the blockchain is doing is one of the most important things. And if you don't price accurately, then you're going to have a bad time. That was like, the Shanghai DOS attacks was due to mispricing of resources. And any project, say, is like, spamming the network. In theory, like pricing should prevent any spam. Where spam in this case is like something that is like, slowing the blockchain down, or like, I believe that we need to be careful in saying that it's like bad to use the blockchain in any way, right? Because everyone is like paying for gas, right? So as long as you're paying for gas, like you can use the blockchain however you want. And it's our job to make sure that everything is priced reasonably, so it's not creating, negative externalities for users. But as long as you're willing to pay for it, then that's great usage of the blockchain.
I think that's a really fresh idea to particularly the analysts like us, because we barely talk to the protocol designers. And I think that basically presents a different solution compared to the data SaaS companies, say like Shadow, Ghost Logs, Sim.io. Here is a different solution using potentially a temporary storage similar to blobs for basically, say, storing all the events in the future as a potential. I'm curious though, so using blobs as an example, now it's been 2 months, 3 months, I guess, since the Duncan upgrade. Does analysts find it hard to actually analyze blobs data? So first of all, now that all the data are only temporary, we need some sidecars like data providers still to cache it somewhere in now a decentralized database, I guess, and then import it in Dune or somewhere. And so then we can actually analyze what actually happened during that time for the confirmation batch go to Ethereum from the L2s. Does that also affect the trust assumption? Like, say, is it as credible as what the node's going to provide you in a real-time fashion? And does that create overhead for people to analyze and store them, etc.? I guess from L2 perspective, do you see that like actually creates some, how to say, barrier of data transparency? I don't know. Yeah, curious. Anyone's
Yeah.
opinion. Yeah.
I mean, that's a great point. All the blobs are committed to cryptographically in the history. So if somebody just comes up to you and hands you like a blob on a piece of paper, you could like look at that blob and basically, do a little bit of cryptography and know that that is a canonical blob. So when it comes to like the integrity of this data, you can do checks with the blockchain to make sure that it is correct and that it is, a blob that belongs. But you are right; it does add extra storage constraints, and I think that this is going to be a growing pain in this industry, right? Because we traditionally have thought of blockchains like databases, right? Like we think about, storing all this data in it, and then we can just, do our queries right against it. But we're kind of moving in this world where blockchains can be thought of more like, bulletin boards. And the service that the blockchain provides is, you can ask it like, was this piece of paper pinned to the bulletin board at this time?
Are you able to verify what was written in that paper?
Totally. Yeah. So you can, this is like what blobs are, this is kind of like what Celestia is, right? The idea where you can just know that like certain information was in the blockchain at a certain time. And this is kind of, the modular mindset. This is decoupling execution from consensus. And basically this is how we get the, next magnitude of growth in the industry by, decoupling this. And the reason why we're doing this is because we learned how difficult it is to scale something like, Ethereum, where consensus is coupled to execution. We can't really scale that and provide the cheapest gas, because if we want to build, infrastructure that the entire world uses, we need to like push the cost of gas down to like, zero. Like it needs to be so low that anyone can just use it. TLDR, we kind of need to reconceptualize how we think about blockchains as bulletin boards rather than databases.
So to kind of, like you already gave a TLDR, but if I just repeat this back to you, you were saying we have a problem with like IO reads on blockchains in general, and like whether it's Ethereum L1 or it's the different L2s. And you see the best way to optimize this problem at the moment, or like the easiest path to solve this, because like state like expiry and all of that stuff, state rent, like we don't want to go into that right now. So EIP 4/4s is the like quickest win we can have right now, and it's probably like a small percentage of like storage we can save, but like over time that actually will make a large difference. Did I understand that correctly?
Yeah, totally. So EIP 4/4s is definitely our best short-term solution. That only works with history expiry, right? So history is the blocks and the receipts. It does not help with state expiry. Right now, there really is no solution to state expiry. Everything is really complicated. But, from like an L2 kind of centric perspective, I would say that the easiest solution for state expiry is just use another chain. We're like, people might not agree with me, but, I believe in making really simple tooling to like migrate all of your state between chains, right? So if you spin up an L2 and the state becomes incredibly bloated and there's no like in protocol way to like expire that state, and you don't want to deal with like the state of like, whatever random project that is, bloating it, you should be able to just take your state and go someplace else. It's kind of like, the ability to exit your state, I think, is really important.
That's a very novel and exciting idea. I think Gelato is working on this quite closely at the moment. There was some talk in East Berlin where I was just sitting there like, you can't, like, who's gonna analyze this data, Hilmar? Like, Hilmar is the CEO, and I was like if you take like parts of the state, you put it into some other chain, like it's gonna get very complicated. But yeah, it's like, I think you're like the allegory of like a bulletin board instead of a database like took a moment for me. But yeah, I can see how that would be the only way how we can really scale these systems. And I guess we as a data provider, or like the general industry, just needs to find other solutions, like Shadow, like Ghost, or like, I don't know, custom subgraphs or something like this, to actually be able to verify and track all of this data, or like to make sense of the world that we live in, I guess. So yeah, with these new inputs, I think like before this call, Denning and Dobby here, we're like, oh no, like they're gonna take away our events, like, oh, like this is horrible. We're not gonna be able to analyze anything anymore. And like, if you don't like deeply like understand the topic, or like if you haven't thought about it deeply, like it's like a shortcut reaction of like, hey, like, yeah, of course, like I need these events to actually do my job. Like, what are we doing here? And like, if you take away my events, like, do you know how many goddamn like analyst hours we all need to spend to like actually replicate like the cost of like 50 cents per transaction? Is it worth it to not emit events? And then you have to like hire 3 data engineers and 1 data analyst to actually fix your mess. Like, I think that's like a trade-off that's like maybe not considered a lot. So with all of this new knowledge that we've gained, Denning, Dobby, what do you kind of take away from this conversation? And maybe Denning, if you want to go first.
Yeah, I think I'm definitely like understanding better, rather than just say no, less events gonna be worse in terms of data reporting. I think both of them stand on the ground of like not actually saying less events, but actually more events and better events. So for, better data reporting, but definitely at the compromise of the, I guess, like the chain security guarantee, right? Because like it's either going to be some sidecar with data sets provider or temporary storage that it's going to be as on compromise, either say, is it credible as the chain consensus itself, or at the compromise of saying adding some overhead of data pipelining. But I think that's not a problem that's like stopping us. It's like addressable problem. You can definitely build tools to make the data pipelining and like importing this data much easier. Yeah, I think it's a trade-off, but I think it's something that I can accept as a data analyst. So yeah.
Yeah, I think on the trust assumption piece, one sort of thing that we think about a lot, we sort of see like there being 3 important kind of like considerations to be made for off-chain events to truly become useful to everybody. And so the first one is that they're easy for downstream tooling to pick up. And that's why we put out ERC 7571, makes it easy for, frameworks like Foundry to be able to like, take shadow contract code and then generate like 2 different versions of bytecode, one that's used on mainnet and then one that's used off-chain. The second is that we really believe that off-chain events should be independently verifiable. And that's why we put out Shadow Ref a month ago. And so what we mean by that is you obviously don't have the full trust assumptions and full security guarantees that Ethereum does. But I think the fact is that most people today already rely on data warehousing or analytics platforms to consume events in the first place, as opposed to like querying a node directly themselves. But the difference with on-chain events is that there are checks and balances, right? Like anyone can run their own mainnet node and verify the results themselves. And now with Shadow Ref, you can do that with a Shadow kind of or off-chain event as well. So like we sort of see it's important that like much in the same way that anyone can verify the data that they get from a hosted mainnet RPC provider, they should be able to do that with Shadow logs too. And then the third thing, which we haven't talked as much about, but is kind of like something that we have definitely heard from the community and have plans to build, is going back to what Boxer had brought up earlier, where it's like oftentimes you can take and trust the interpretation, the event logs that are written by the smart contract developer themselves and use it, right? Like you have peace of mind knowing that you can inspect the source code yourself to see if it's true. And so they're very legible to the community, meaning like everyone can kind of like have access to them and they can see what's going on. And so we think that's currently a missing piece with off-chain events, and it's something that we're planning to address. But basically, not everyone will need to rewrite the same off-chain events. It's very valuable to have like pre-existing interpretations of what's happening that you can decide to like use, and you can inspect yourself and verify their kind of accuracy and like the data that they're generating is telling you. And so those could come from the smart contract deployer. They could come from other entities that have different goals and different use cases that might be different than the smart contract deployer. But we are very much planning to kind of, create a way where people can upload like shadow contract or like shadow contract implementations, and then anyone can kind of verify, the event logic that's within them, and then pull that down and use it on their own shadow fork, whether they're hosting that themselves or running it through a hosted platform like the one that we provide. So similar to kind of like spells in the spell book, like you'll be able to, see these different contract implementations that have additional data instrumentation that you can decide to opt into or not.
When I'm making analysis in general, I try to minimize third-party reliance and solely use on-chain data because there's a bunch of reasons. I think third-party reliance, like it's just you have higher, more trust assumptions, and it's not necessarily the right way to go. And it's not about any single protocol. I think Reservoir uploaded the data originally to Dune, but I wanted to do it through Spellbook so that I have full understanding of what is going on, what is actually happening behind the scenes. What is Shadow's future looking like, and how are you planning to decentralize so that I have kind of lower trust assumptions? How do you foresee this going forward?
Yeah. So we sort of believe in like sufficient decentralization, right? So it's like, what needs to be true in order for someone to feel comfortable with like using and relying on the on-chain data that they're getting from an off-chain log? If you like, really wanted to run all of this yourself, you can do that today, right? You can run it on your own Reth node. You can write your own shadow contracts, compile it, deploy it. Like you can do this all locally. Like you don't have to use any sort of hosted platform, and kind of like own the entire stack yourself today. So if that is kind of your prerogative, then you can do that. If you don't want to go through the hassle of like running a node and like building the pipelines to decode things and handle like factory created contracts, things like that, then we provide like a hosted platform that you can that handles a lot of that gnarly infrastructure type stuff for you. And so it's really, about kind of presenting people more choice and more control over like how they extract signal and interpretation from what's happening on chain. I think like another way to kind of reframe the question is like, do all data interpretation layers need to have the same security guarantee as Ethereum, or need to have like the same kind of like third party trust assumptions as Ethereum? Like hosted subgraphs, decentralized subgraphs, data warehouse providers. And I think the answer to that is like clearly no, right? Like it just depends on your use case and like what is important to you and like how you're planning to use that data and what dependencies like are being based on that data. And so with, the Shadow hosted platform and Shadow Reth, we sort of see that as like, giving people two options of like being able to run off-chain logs entirely themselves and be able to verify like, what is happening and like own all the code that's generating these things versus having like a more turnkey solution in a hosted platform.
Yeah, I guess like you touched upon something. I think that's like a very long conversation that we don't have time for right now. But I think like just in the small context of like Uniswap v3, I think your canonical example is always like liquidity tick crossed or something. This is like very product specific Uniswap v3 data. Like, do I really need to be able to verify this through an event log that's on the blockchain? Probably not. Yep. Do I need to know that I've swapped X amount of currency for Y amount of currency in whatever pool? Tools like Xerion and Zapper and Rodkey and like self-hosted solutions should probably just be able to pick that up very easily. Yeah. So it's like it's all like a gradient and a scale rather than a black and white conversation here.
Yeah. Just to like kind of put some quantification on that particular example. So we spent like a session with the Uniswap research team to basically ask, like if you guys could go crazy with events, like what would you add? What params would you add? What events would you add? And it was like a 45 minute session, and they had a list of ideas, and we implemented them. And the amount of event data that was generated as a result of that was more than 5x the amount of event data that is currently being emitted by Uni v3 pools. And that was just like off a single brainstorm, right? This morning, we put out a case study with Pendle Finance, where they've been using Shadow to get a bunch of extra data about their router contract to improve like their trade routing algorithm on the Pendle AMM. And if you kind of take a look at that case study, it becomes very, very clear that like these are not things that you would ever think to put in an on-chain event to start. And like oftentimes it requires like you to actually see what is happening on chain and like how users are using it before. It's like the classic kind of like data analysis, data science to like product iteration feedback loop, right? That just I think is currently quite broken today with on-chain products.
What do you see is the biggest challenging for anyone or the teams you've been talking to adopt the tool? What are the main complaint or like the overhead that they're seeing for using the tool like this?
So the main barrier that we've sort of seen is that it is people don't really want to just rip out their existing indexing system. Like it requires like it's a lot of work, right, to be able to like just rethink your indexing. And so what we've kind of found is that it's much easier for us to kind of have someone start using us when they're at a point where they're either developing a new set of contracts, because then they have the opportunity to rethink like how indexing is going to work for that set of contracts, or they're planning on making like an app level change that requires indexing that it just won't work well with their current like kind of indexing setup. What we've been kind of working with folks on is just like, when does it make sense to rethink indexing? What are certain parts of your indexing stack that you can start to use like off-chain events for? And how do you sequence that like over time and potentially eventually like kind of have more and more stuff off-chain with your indexing system versus like kind of using, you know, on-chain logs. And so that's probably been the thing that we've like worked through the most with various teams. What we've seen is that like, you know, the thing that has the lowest barrier to adoption is if you are doing kind of research or you want to do internal analysis on like what's happening today, because it doesn't really affect as much stuff in prod, right? And so that's been kind of like the dance that we've had with a lot of DeFi teams with regards to how they think about onboarding onto Shadow and using it meaningfully.
Are Shadow clients more the teams themselves for their own events, or are they more teams that want to integrate other protocols and have a deeper look into those?
Yeah, it's a good question. So to date, they've been mostly the actual teams themselves with their own contracts, like the protocol teams. And I think that's perhaps like a function of just there's certain parts of the stack that we are still working on that will make it more valuable to other people who are more like integrators, right? Like the Parsecs of the world, the Dunes of the world, DeFi Llama, like kind of companies like that. I think with some of what we talked about earlier, like kind of making off-chain events more legible to the community is one kind of big unlock I sort of see there, because not everyone, like no one really wants to go into every single contract that they care about and like write their own versions of like those off-chain events, right? Like that's a pretty large ask. And so we sort of see a world where the protocol teams themselves are like writing Shadow contract implementations, publishing them into a place where anyone can pull them down and run them however they want. And then that becomes data set that people can kind of base their indexing or analytics or warehousing solutions on top of.
Makes sense. Okay. Yeah. So everyone can query the spellbook, a public spellbook in a way.
Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe to go up a level in the conversation again. So Danny gave us like her take on events or no events. So what's your takeaway from this conversation?
My takeaway is like it's not black and white. I think it's definitely in the gray area. My current problems that I'm concerned with is, for example, Ambient is a protocol that no one so far has managed to like add to Spellbook, or at least put in the time to, because the way I see it is, in the current state, if you remove events, that gas saving you have is going to be basically put into, like Boxer said earlier, analyst times, who's going to try to unravel what is going on. You know, like it's annoying that we can't have like Ambient and compare it to the rest. And there's also stuff like, if you look across different websites don't actually agree exactly on what the current Ethereum supply is. And that's because there's all types of concentration. Boxer mentioned also uncle blocks, for example, which are harder to track, and stuff like this. And having events all over the place would have helped in that regard in having a consensus on how many Ethereum actually currently in existence. But I agree that it's also significantly an overhead in all the ways we described. Mark, you mentioned this before, but blob-like kind of approach is kind of not exactly blob because of the consideration you mentioned, but having a constant state size that is dedicated to events does make sense, making sure that not everyone needs to track full history. My concerns are more about ease of use of events. Your concerns are going to be more about the infrastructure. And I think there's like an agreement there that we can come up with. I just don't agree with outright removing events in general.
Well,
Totally.
thankfully,
everything has trade-offs.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, thankfully, no one advocates for that. This idea of a bulletin board and like Ethereum is a state machine is like a very good allegory to that. I think as data analysts, we kind of need to keep this more in mind. We're like, yeah, this is like a computer that keeps track of state. And like, we are not necessarily the first consumers of this, even though one of the core principles of the blockchain should be that like everything is verifiable and like everyone can kind of understand what is going on. And like sometimes like you need a Hildopy to like explain NFT data for you. But like if one analyst can take that like burden on themselves and kind of like move the space forward, like that seems to me to be a level of like complexity that is like reasonable. So like how do we get more to this bulletin board state machine? How do we accelerate the bulletin board and how do we make it work more smoothly while at the same time kind of maintaining the like trust assumption of a blockchain that like a reasonable actor within a blockchain system should be able to kind of make sense of what is happening. So maybe Mark, what's your predictions? Like 3 years from now, like where do you wish we would be in regards to these topics?
Yeah, totally. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is if we kind of build in a shadow first way, you could imagine just having a real event that emits a hash and then have the shadow events emit the pre-image, like the data that is being hashed. Like that's like a very simple way to add verifiability directly to, shadow events. Longer term, I think it's really important that we kind of rethink the way that we're pricing, things on the blockchain. Multi-dimensional gas pricing. This is like a thing that the EF researchers talk about a bunch. You could just like imagine there being like a base fee for storage, a base fee for, call data or like network, and then, a base fee for like, CPU compute. That would like help a lot, right? Like the goal is to like make pricing of all the resources as accurate as possible. And then that will like let the free market kind of decide, like how much these things are used, right? Because really nothing should be problematic, right? If we priced everything super accurately, nothing should be problematic when it comes to, how you're using a blockchain. So the fact that we're talking about this is a problem, this raises a flag for me saying that our pricing of the blockchain operations is off. So yeah, over the long term, I think that we need to like make the pricing as accurate as possible.
All right. I think that is a wonderful statement to end on. And hopefully we can manage that as an ecosystem. Anyone want to plug anything, any last words that you think we should discuss here?
No, I think my only, last comment is like, it's been very cool to see over the last like 12 to 18 months, a bunch of different, entities think together about how to further scale Ethereum. I think that's kind of like the overarching theme or undercurrent that like a lot of us are working towards. And so, it was cool to hop on this podcast and talk to you guys about that. I appreciate you having us on. Yeah,
I think there's more peace between event doubters and the analyst community after this podcast. At least if we've managed to do that. I'm a big fan of both Shadow and Ghost Locks. I've tested and used both products, and it really is a game changer where like as an analyst you're no longer constrained to whatever the dev thought was a good idea 3 years ago, but rather you can just kind of go in there, grab a bunch of stuff yourself. So I'm very optimistic about these solutions and what it can bring for analysts. And yeah, excited to see the space evolve. Yeah, thanks so much for coming on, Alvin, Mark. Honored to have you. Thank you for listening to the Index podcast, and we will catch you in 2 weeks. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, guys.
Crypto day wasters, come join us for the parade. From Bitcoin ETF to Solana, Bitcoin. set chart crime on fire.